Well, my thanks to the department for the opportunity to speak at this 50th anniversary celebration. It's great to be here on this panel, and especially with Ivo Dalder. He and I are general exam mates from 1985. And for Ivo, it may have been luck, but it certainly wasn't dumb. And by comparison with Ivo and the other panelists, I have relatively limited government experience and not in management. I was 2 years in the Carter administration's Arms Control and Disarmament Agency on arms trade controls and policy planning. And then later on, 2 years at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency's Advanced Systems and Concepts Office, straddling the Clinton and Bush 43 presidencies. But my aim and ambition had always been to work in international security policy studies and analysis. And that's where my career track was laid, with a great assist from being in Cambridge and at MIT, but in the DC think tank community. Rather than focus on major power policies and struggles, I used a funding opportunity, also shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, my version of dumb luck, to enter the rather sparsely occupied area of UN peacekeeping operations, which were just then reviving after about a decade of dormancy. 5 years, 2 books, and a few articles later, the UN peacekeeping had risen and fallen in Angola, Somalia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. By the end of the 90s, even the UN General Assembly was disassembling the UN's ability to do complex peacekeeping. But in the spring and summer of '99 came NATO airstrikes to subdue ethnic cleansing in Kosovo and the raising of East Timor after it voted to separate itself from its Indonesian occupiers. The UN Security Council, perhaps even to its own surprise, and certainly to the surprise of the UN Secretariat and the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, tasked that department to exercise temporary governance of Kosovo and East Timor. These were the starting guns of a remarkable resurgence in UN peace operations, but a resurgence for which the Secretariat and UN member states were really badly prepared. Secretary General Annan decided that to learn to not touch this thing on the side. To save itself from even greater than anticipated grief in its new responsibilities, the UN needed to undertake the sort of fundamental review of its capabilities, its needs, and its prospects that it had failed to do at the start of the 1990s. In this case, written products simmering on the shelf until needed proved useful, and people in Annan's office found my books and asked me, tracked me down at my desk at DTRA, asked me to come up to New York. I had a few interviews, and 3 weeks later I was working for Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the UN's top troubleshooter on political military issues, working as project director for the panel on peace operations. We had 4 months to research and write up recommendations on how to adapt the UN to its new field environment. What became known as the Brahimi Report was released in August 2000. Over the next few budget cycles, the UN's Department of Peacekeeping Operations, or DPKO, tripled in size and continued to grow into the 2000s. But the headquarters costs remained less than 5% of the UN's peacekeeping budget because its fielded personnel grew from about 30,000 when we wrote to the report to about 125,000 today. About 90,000 uniformed military personnel, 13,000 cops, 16,000 civilians in 16 operations, 8 of which are seriously complex combinations of all 3 of those issue areas. In the years since the Brahimi Report, and despite the rhetoric and effort that goes into mandate development and mission planning, essential knowledge of the mission area and its politics and people that's critical to success remains a sparse commodity, especially at mission startup. The theory of change that deploys with a mission is generally some version of the theory of change that was used in the last 2 or 3 operations of a similar kind. And it's more or less sketched from knowledge that it resides largely in the heads of senior managers and mission leaders, and it leaves when they leave the mission. Handover of knowledge to successors is haphazard, and senior mission personnel rarely get to hire their own subordinates or to vet and brief their own successors, let alone introduce them to their local counterparts. But articulating a fully adapted theory of change may be politically fraught, as it may indicate replacement of wartime leaders, local wartime leaders, as quickly as possible, and disruption of lucrative criminal networks that traffic in diamonds, guns, gold, and humans, to which those leaders may be rather closely connected and significantly benefiting. Since a UN mission may have neither the power nor the authority to replace leaders or disrupt networks, laying it all out may just make those who would have to change or make way for change double down on their old ways. We've seen this in the DRC, Haiti, Sudan, and South Sudan, but also in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Just to be clear that the UN is not the only intervening power to face this dilemma, except that the UN peace operations do not deploy for the purpose of coercive regime change. Rather, over the last 15 years, it has repeatedly been sent in to help hold states together in the face of continuing tensions or spoiler activities from groups outside of peace processes or those inside, as in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Haiti. Where the intervention has more or less worked over time, the locale has been small, as in these examples, but none has been easy, and none has been successful without continuing political attention from at least one great power. The main risk embedded in UN operations is not that they threaten the supported state, but that they foster development of long-term dependency on outside support. And that's not because it isn't possible to raise up functioning institutions in post-conflict settings, but because local leaders or neighboring states can siphon away more resources or play to their local political bases without fatal consequences if there's an international stabilization net that absorbs the shock. This deeper political involvement happened after it became clear from the 1990s that elections alone were not enough to create sustainable political solutions in nearly post-war settings. But as the UN deepened its involvement in political reconstruction, it lost a bright line that defined its exit strategy. Exit strategies for later operations had to be developed within the mission itself. The first mission to do that was the one in Liberia, and it took it about 3 years to get there. It hasn't yet ended, but it has drawn down to about 1/3 of its original size. By contrast, the operation in the DRC, wrestling with a country of 70 million people whose eastern borders were and are rather porous, had no exit strategy 10 years after it had first deployed, and it's been refocused and relabeled a stabilization operation, as are the missions in Haiti, Chad, Central African Republic. The problem is that stabilization per se doesn't contribute much to local self-supporting governance capacity, and thus to mission exit. The requirement for separate high-level political support is never greater than in such circumstances, but because the UN tends to be assigned to orphaned conflicts, then with the possible exception of France and certain Francophone African states, consistent political support is in the same lane as reliable electrical power, more aspirational than real. And when it does appear, such support is not controllable and may just make local armed actors mad. Well, having fixed that area of human endeavor, I broadened the scope of my work in collaboration with the Hague Institute for Global Justice last year. And last summer, we completed phase 1 of work done with the advice and support of a commission on global security, justice, and governance that was chaired by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, this is Madeleine Albright Day, and former Nigerian Foreign Minister Ibrahim Gambari, with the assistance of about a dozen folks of similar experience from Japan, China, India, Brazil, so forth. The Commission's June report highlighted growing deficiencies in capacity to manage critical global issues with the tools and policies that we have at hand presently, and as presently configured. It noted initiatives in governance being undertaken by subnational and non-governmental entities to circumvent those limitations. Governance for purposes of this work includes formal and informal institutions that are to some degree authoritative mechanisms for steering states and societies and elements thereof toward collective goals. The report emphasized in particular the security and justice aspects of governance in 3 intersecting spaces of human endeavor: political or public space, transactional space, and ecological space. The respective exemplary issues we looked at were conflict-affected states, hyperconnectivity in the global economy, and the current and projected impact of climate change on human security and livelihoods. In each of these areas, governance is undertaken not just by governance, but by a range of public and private actors, formally or informally organized, and with or without national-level government sanction. For fragile states, this includes the large array of human rights, humanitarian relief, and reconstruction-oriented NGOs present in a conflict and post-conflict zone. These may be contracted to governments or to international organizations, and they frequently are, but they still have their own agendas. Governance in transactional space includes arrangements for international exchange of currency and securities, private and national, and the heretofore largely private operational structure of the internet over which governments are increasingly asserting primacy, as Nazli Shukri noted. Governance in ecological space includes growing numbers of subnational and non-governmental actors networking to implement solutions to pressing problems that climate change poses or will soon pose for them and for their constituencies, while their national governments continue to lock horns in the arena of the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. Our colleagues at the Chicago Council, of course, are all over these kinds of initiatives with their own Global Cities initiative. The report makes a number of recommendations. I won't go into them here, probably too many of them. Some relate to repairing or amending current global institutions. Others relate to blending existing elements of multi-stakeholder and multi-level governance into approaches for managing and ideally preventing some of the worst foreseeable outcomes in each critical space in ways that benefit from their multi-actor character, but are also guided by sufficiently coherent goals and principles that the net result is not just another muddle and is viewed as legitimate by the widest possible range of influential actors. Thanks.